When you read Psalm 51, it's helpful to know that David wrote it and the circumstances under which he wrote it. It helps you get, or at least it helps me get, more of the meaning of the words in the psalm, knowing the information behind it. So I decided to do a little experiment on that and learn about some of the hymns that are sung today. In this video, we're going to talk about the song "It Is Well With My Soul," which is one of the most famous Christian songs ever, really. If you had a contest for what's the greatest Christian song of all time, it would get a lot of votes. Obviously, which song's the greatest is not really that valuable an exercise, and it would be subjective anyway. But for many, many people, it is a very meaningful song. So we're going to dive into the story behind it. It's not only a well-known song, but it's also a well-known story. What precipitated the poem that was originally written, then the eventual addition of music, and its first singing, and what transpired there. The poem was written by Horatio Spafford of Chicago. Spafford was a very successful businessman. He was a lawyer, had a lot of investments that were doing really, really well. He was married to a lady named Anna, and they had 4 daughters: Annie, Maggie, Bessie, and Tanetta. They were strong believers and went to a Presbyterian church in Chicago. The oldest Spafford daughters, Annie and Maggie, decided they wanted to become full members of the church. Famous evangelist D.L. Moody was concerned that they were probably too young, didn't really understand what they'd be getting into, and so he had a conversation with the 2 girls separately, and after that he said, "These girls know more than I do. They can be members anytime," or something like that. It shows how dedicated Horatio and Anna were to teaching their daughters. Obviously, this was their daughter's decision, but they couldn't have known what they knew without strong support from their parents. So we have a wealthy Chicago family. In October of 1871, there occurred the Great Chicago Fire, and this greatly damaged Spafford's business interests. But not so much that he couldn't afford to take his family on a vacation to Europe. Great improvements in transatlantic travel had occurred in the 1800s, and now, instead of taking months to get across the Atlantic, it only took a little over a week. So it was much more accessible for people to ride steamships across the ocean back and forth. Due to some business situation, Spafford sent his wife and daughters across first, intending to follow shortly thereafter. They were crossing the Atlantic in a highly luxurious steamship that I'm going to not be able to pronounce correctly, so I'm just going to write it in the description. But while crossing the Atlantic, their ship collided with another ship, and the ship sank in 12 minutes. All 4 daughters, Annie, Maggie, Bessie, and Tanetta, were lost at sea. They were never seen again. Anna Spafford was found unconscious. At some point, she had to be watched carefully to make sure she didn't cast herself into the sea. Anna made it safely to England, or the UK anyway. She sent a telegram to her husband, famously saying, "Saved alone, what shall I do?" So Horatio got a boat and headed over to England to go be with his wife. And now the story goes that while he was on his way across the Atlantic, the captain or someone on the ship told him they were about the spot where the collision had occurred, and it was there that he wrote the words to "It Is Well With My Soul." I don't know how true that is. Ira Sankey said that he wrote it in 1876. It could be that there's some truth to it, that the idea was there, or he started writing it, or came up with some of the phrases, or whatever. But it was certainly inspired by the shipwreck. In fact, the tune has the name of the ship. So the Spaffords came home and tried to rebuild their life. Moody apparently advised Anna to throw herself into serving others to help deal with her grief, advice which she took. And they went on from there. So about 3 years later, in the fall of 1876, Moody was planning this very large evangelistic event in Chicago, which included a large number of singers. I think it was somewhere around 1,000. Around this time, Horatio's friend Philip Bliss was writing the tune to It Is Well With My Soul. And two things happened in November 1876. One was Bliss sang the song, its first public performance, before a very large number of people at Farwell Hall in Chicago. November 16th was the day that Horatio and Anna Spafford had their fifth child, their son, Horatio. When the song is introduced, Horatio and Anna have restarted building a family with their son. But the deaths of their 4 daughters are not the only tragedy that surrounds the song. Philip Bliss and his wife had a child that died a few years before this. So Bliss knew what it was like to lose a child. And the child was his only child at that time, though they did after that have 2 sons named Paul and George, who were 4 and 2 at this time. And then the third tragedy that surrounds this song was that a little over a month after introducing the song, Philip Bliss and his wife Lucy were killed in a train wreck in Ashtabula, Ohio, leaving their 2 sons as orphans. So these 3 tragedies surround the creation of the song, It Is Well With My Soul. And yet the song took off from there. But the Spaffords weren't done with tragedy. In 1878, they had a daughter, Bertha. But in 1880, their son Horatio died of scarlet fever. Then in 1881, they had their last child, Grace. And Bertha and Grace both grew up and lived long lives. I'm currently reading a book by Bertha called Our Jerusalem. Shortly after Grace was born, the Spaffords moved to Jerusalem, and Bertha grew up there and lived there. And in 1950, she wrote a book about her family's many decades in Jerusalem, and I'm just starting to read that. Paul and George Bliss also both grew up, lived to be roughly 60 years old. Paul Bliss became a composer like his father, not to the degree of success his father had, but he was successful. He was one of those people who was very successful in his own time, although his music isn't really played today like his father's is. Paul Bliss, late in his life, said he grew to greatly revere his father, and Bertha, throughout her book, when she speaks of her parents, speaks of them very reverently and always calls them father, refers to them as father and mother with capital F, capital M, and in a deeply respectful manner. Her father died when she was 10, so tragedy for her too. Anyway, that's a lot of the history behind the song It Is Well With My Soul. There's an interesting story about how Mrs. Bliss saw things. Moody wanted the Blisses to go to England with him, and the question came up, well, what about your sons? Will they go? And she said, well, they'll get just as good a care from my sister, and they love her as much as they love me, so if it makes sense for them to stay home, they'll stay home. And then it was said to her, well, that's good, because then if there's some sort of accident and something happens to you, then the boys will be safe. And then she said, well, I don't even think about that, because if it's God's will that we all go and we're all drowned, then so be it. Then, so that was her attitude. She was accepting of whatever would come their way. And it was only a few weeks later that she and her husband were killed in the train wreck. And word was sent out about the train wreck by a telegram, and people assumed that their boys were with them and had died. And so it was reported in the media that Mr. and Mrs. Bliss and their kids were killed in the train wreck, and everyone and all their friends in Chicago believed that. And it was maybe a day or two later that they got word the boys were safe with their other relatives. So with these technological advancements of ships getting you across the sea and trains getting you across the land and telegrams getting messages around really quickly, each one of those is a double-edged sword. Yeah, information travels fast, but so does false information. So with these stories in mind, at least for myself, I can better appreciate the words to the song. The first verse: when peace like a river attendeth my way, when sorrows like sea billows roll. So that's contrasting things going really well or things going really badly. And if you look at the lives of the writers, they had a good bit of both. But whatever they get, whether it's good or bad, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul. So they could be content whether good things happened or bad things happened. Then in the second verse, when the trials come, they believed they could still be assured that Christ had died for them and that everything would be okay in the end. And in the third verse, he expresses his confidence that his sins are forgiven, not just partly forgiven, but all forgiven. And he doesn't have to bear his guilt and sin anymore. Then finally, in the fourth verse, he looks forward to the return of Christ, when his faith will be sight and all really will be well, because these tragedies still happen and they still hurt a lot. There's no shortage of recordings of it as well with my soul out there, so if you go listen to it and think about the stories and see if that has an effect on how you appreciate the song. I'm going to include a instrumental version of it here at the end of this video.